Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Welcome back to Cursed Relics. Tonight, we enter the cold stone walls of an ancient estate, Lovell Castle. Here, a noble knight discovers that some artifacts do not just witness history. They bear the scars and whisper the secrets of it. Our tale tonight is one of honor, betrayal, and the long, cold memory of stone. It is a story that reminds us that some objects, particularly those forged in violence and witnessed to tragedy, do not simply exist in the present. They are artifacts that carry the past within them, not as a silent history, but as a living, breathing, and often vengeful presence. Our journey takes us to the north of England, to a wild and windswept landscape dominated by one ancient and brooding landmark, Lovell Castle. Our protagonist is a man who embodies the very ideals of a bygone era. Sir Philip Harclay was a knight in the truest sense of the word. He was a man of impeccable honor, unwavering courage, and a deep, abiding sense of justice. His face, weathered by time and campaigns in foreign lands, was a map of a life lived by a strict and noble code. In his youth, he had been the dearest friend and sworn brother-in-arms to the old Lord Lovell, the rightful master of the castle. Together, they had been paragons of chivalry. But time and war had separated them. Sir Philip had spent the last 2 decades away, serving his king on distant shores, while his friend, Lord Lovell, had met a tragic and untimely end, or so the stories said. Now, old and weary, Sir Philip was finally returning home, his heart heavy with nostalgia and a deep, unspoken grief for the friend he had lost. He had returned to a world that had changed. News had reached him that Lovell Castle, the ancestral home of his friend's noble line, had passed into the hands of a distant, and previously unknown, cousin. And so, Sir Philip, driven by a sense of duty to his fallen friend's memory, rode towards the castle, seeking to pay his respects to the new lord and to once again walk the halls that held so many memories of his youth. As he approached the castle, a sense of deep and profound unease began to settle over him. Lovell Castle was not a gentle, welcoming place. It was an ancient estate, a true fortress of the old world. It rose from the rugged landscape like a set of jagged, broken teeth, its immense gray stone walls streaked with centuries of rain and sorrow. Its towers were tall and severe, its narrow windows like the eyes of a suspicious and unfriendly giant. It was a place built for war and siege, not for comfort. Even in its glory days, under the rule of his friend, the castle had possessed a kind of stern, melancholy grandeur. But now, as Sir Philip looked upon it, it felt different, felt sick. The very air around the castle seemed heavy, charged with a palpable sense of forgotten history and a deep, unresolved sorrow. The wind that howled around its battlements did not sound like a natural force. It sounded like a lament, a constant, mournful cry for a justice that had never been delivered. The stones themselves seemed to exude a coldness that had nothing to do with the damp English climate. It was the coldness of a place that had witnessed a terrible wrong, a wrong that had seeped into the very foundations of the building, poisoning it from within. Sir Philip, a man of action and not of fanciful notions, tried to dismiss the feeling. He was tired from his long journey. He was grieving for his friend. It was only natural that his imagination would color his perceptions. But the feeling persisted, a cold, hard knot of dread in the pit of his stomach. His reception at the castle did little to ease his mind. The new baron, a man of cold, calculating eyes and a thin, bloodless smile, greeted him with a veneer of perfect, yet utterly hollow courtesy. There was a watchfulness in the new lord's gaze, a suspicion that was deeply at odds with the welcome a man of Sir Philip's stature should have received. The servants, too, were different. The old, familiar faces of the Lovell household were gone, replaced by a new staff who moved with a silent, furtive unease, their eyes constantly darting towards their new master, as if in fear of his displeasure. The atmosphere within the castle was one of suppression and fear. The old, boisterous life of the place had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. Sir Philip endured a formal, joyless dinner in the great hall, a vast, echoing chamber where he and the old Lord Lovell had once feasted and laughed for hours. Now, the only sounds were the polite, strained conversation of the new baron and the clinking of cutlery on plates. The magnificent tapestries on the walls, depicting the heroic deeds of the Lovell ancestors, seemed to look down on the scene with faded, sorrowful disapproval. Sir Philip felt like a ghost at his own feast, a relic from a past age that had no place in this new, cold world. He felt, with a growing and terrible certainty, that something was profoundly wrong at Lovell Castle. The story he had been told that his friend had died honorably in a foreign war felt thin and brittle, a convenient lie stretched over a much darker and more complicated truth. After the grim mockery of the dinner was concluded, Sir Philip, desperate to escape the suffocating presence of his host, excused himself. He claimed fatigue from his journey, a plausible excuse that the Baron accepted with a small, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. But Sir Philip had no intention of retiring. He was driven by a powerful and deeply unsettling urge, a wave of nostalgia, so strong it was almost a physical ache washed over him. He needed to walk the halls of this castle alone. He needed to revisit the places of his youth, to reconnect with the memory of his friend, and perhaps, to find some answer to the gnawing unease that was plaguing him. His feet, seemingly of their own accord, led him away from the main chambers and down a series of long, dark, and disused corridors. He was heading towards a part of the castle that he remembered with a boyish fondness, a place of wonder and adventure from his youth. He was heading towards the old armory. In the days of the old Lord Lovell, the armory had been a place of life and pride. It was where the family's martial history was displayed, where the swords and armor of their ancestors were kept polished and ready. It was a place of gleaming steel, bright banners, and the proud, clean smell of oil and leather. He and his friend had spent countless hours there as boys, playing with blunted swords, dreaming of the heroic deeds they would one day perform. But as he drew closer to that part of the castle, it became clear that the armory had fallen into neglect. The corridors here were colder, the air thick with the dust of years. Cobwebs, thick and gray as funeral shrouds, hung from the vaulted ceilings and draped over the unlit torches in their iron sconces. The stone floors were bare and cold, and his footsteps, the only sound in the deep silence, echoed with a lonely, hollow finality. It was a journey into a dead and forgotten past. He felt a strange, nagging curiosity pulling him forward, a feeling that there was something in that room that he was meant to see. It was an irrational thought, but it was powerful. He felt as if the spirit of his dead friend were calling to him, guiding his steps, leading him towards a revelation. The feeling of being an intruder in the castle faded, replaced by a sense of purpose. He was not just a nostalgic old soldier taking a walk. He was an investigator, a knight on a new and final quest, a quest for a truth that had been deliberately buried. He turned a final corner and saw it at the far end of the long, dark hall, the door to the armory, and the sight of it made him stop in his tracks. A cold shiver, completely unrelated to the damp chill of the corridor, traced its way down his spine. The armory, a room he expected to be plunged in absolute darkness, was not dark. There was a light coming from it. The journey down the echoing corridors had led him to a place that was not as dead and forgotten as he had believed. Something or someone was waiting for him, and with a grim, knightly resolve, he set his jaw and walked towards it, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of the sword at his side. He was walking towards a memory, but he felt, with every fiber of his being, that he was also walking towards a ghost. Sir Philip stood at the far end of the long, dark corridor, a solitary, noble figure silhouetted against the gloom. The door to the armory, 100 yards away, was a faint, rectangular shape in the oppressive darkness, but the strange, pale light that leaked from beneath it was an undeniable and deeply unsettling beacon. His initial, nostalgic quest had now transformed into something else entirely. This was no longer a simple walk down memory lane. This was an approach, confrontation, and every step he took down that echoing hall would be a step deeper into the heart of the castle's cold and silent mystery. His journey began. He moved with the steady, measured tread of a soldier, his boots ringing out on the cold, flagstone floors. Clack, 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 the sound was unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the disused wing. It was a lonely, hollow sound that seemed to be swallowed by the immense, dark space around him. But as he walked, he became acutely aware that his footsteps were not the only sound. The corridor itself seemed to be speaking to him in a language of echoes and whispers. Each footfall was answered by a chorus of faint, ghostly reverberations that seemed to skitter along the stone walls ahead of him and behind him, as if a legion of unseen attendants were marching with him. The corridor was a gallery of ghosts. High on the stone walls, suspended in the deep shadows above, were the portraits of the Lovell ancestors. Their faces were obscured by darkness and grime, but Sir Philip could feel their eyes upon him. He had the distinct and unnerving sensation that these long-dead lords and ladies were watching his progress, their painted gazes following him with a silent, somber intensity. They were the silent witnesses to the castle's history, the guardians of its secrets. And his presence here, a man of the old world returning to a place that had been corrupted, seemed to have stirred them from their centuries of slumber. He felt a sense of approval from them, a silent, ghostly encouragement. They, too, wanted the truth to be known. As he continued his slow, deliberate walk, a new sound began to weave itself into the lonely echo of his footsteps. It was a sound that was so faint at first, he thought it might be a trick of his own ears, or perhaps the wind whistling through a crack in the ancient stone. But as he drew closer to the armory, the sound became more distinct. It was a faint, rhythmic, and metallic sound. Clink, clank, clink, clank. It was an impossibly soft sound, like the gentle, almost musical chime of a single piece of metal shifting against another. It was a sound that was almost lost beneath the growing rumble of the approaching storm outside. A distant peal of thunder would roll across the sky, and for a moment, it would drown out the tiny, metallic sound. But then, in the silence that followed the thunder, the sound would return, as patient and as persistent as a ticking clock. Clink, clank. Sir Philip paused, his head cocked, straining to identify the source. It was a sound that belonged in an armory, the sound of mail and plate armor. But it was not the sound of armor being worn or used. It was too soft, too gentle. It was the sound of a single suit of armor, standing perfectly still, just shifting, settling, as if the metal itself were sighing, as if the empty suit were making a tiny, almost imperceptible adjustment to its posture. The sound was deeply unnatural. It was the sound of something that should be inanimate behaving as if it were alive. A chilling premonition began to form in his mind. The strange light, the metallic size, they were connected. They were coming from the same source. He was about 20 yards from the door now, and the details of it were becoming clearer. It was exactly as he remembered it from his youth. A massive, formidable door made of thick, iron-bound oak. But time had not been kind to it. The iron bands were streaked with rust, like old, dried blood. The wood was dark and splintered, and the entire surface was draped in thick, heavy cobwebs, the work of decades of undisturbed spiders. It was clearly a door that had not been opened in a very, very long time. And yet the light persisted. It was a pale, silvery white light, and it was leaking from the gap between the bottom of the door and the stone floor. It was not the warm, flickering, yellow light of a candle or a torch. It was too cold, too steady, too clean. It had a strange, sterile quality, like moonlight, but there were no windows in this corridor. It was a light that had no natural source, a light that seemed to be a part of the supernatural wrongness of this place. The light was a beacon, and the gentle, metallic sighing was its voice. He finally reached the door, and as he stood before it, a new sensory detail assaulted him, a detail even more disturbing than the light or the sound. The air directly in front of the door was intensely, bitingly cold. It was not a simple draft. He had been walking through a cold, damp corridor, but this was different. This was a pocket of absolute, profound, and stagnant cold. It was as if the air in this one spot had been sealed away for a century, preserving the deep, heartless chill of a long-forgotten winter's night. The cold had a strange, dead quality to it. It did not move or swirl. It simply hung there, a silent, invisible wall of ice. He could feel the cold seeping into his cloak, onto his skin, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was the same kind of unnatural chill that is said to herald the presence of a ghost. And he knew, with a certainty that had now moved beyond premonition and into fact, that whatever was inside that room was not of the living world. The room beyond the door was not just an abandoned armory. It was a tomb, a cold, sealed chamber that held something that had not been allowed to rest. For a moment he hesitated. His hand hovered over the large, iron ring that served as a handle. This was his final chance to turn back, to return to the relative sanity of the rest of the castle, to leave this cold, whispering mystery undisturbed. He could still choose ignorance, but the memory of his friend, the feeling of wrongness in the castle, the silent urging of the ancestral portraits, and the maddening, persistent curiosity that now burned within him, it was too strong. He was a knight, and a knight does not turn away from a challenge, or from a cry for justice, even one that comes from beyond the grave. He took a deep breath, the icy air stinging his lungs. He grasped the cold, iron ring, and with a strength born of grim resolve he pulled. The heavy oak door resisted, its ancient hinges groaning in protest, the sound like a cry of pain. But Sir Philip put his shoulder into it, and with a final, shuddering crack, the seal of years was broken, and the door swung inward, opening into the chamber of echoes, into the heart of the mystery. The cold air from within rushed out to meet him, a ghostly exhalation, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of old steel and an even older sorrow. He had opened the tomb. Now he had to face what lay inside. The great oak door groaned open, revealing the chamber beyond. Sir Philip Harclay stood on the threshold, a silhouette framed against the dark corridor behind him, and stared into the heart of the armory. The room was just as he remembered it from his youth, and yet it was completely, tragically different. The strange, pale light he had seen from the hallway filled the space, a cold, silvery luminescence that gave the entire chamber the ethereal, silent quality of a sunken cathedral. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the thick layer of dust that carpeted the stone floor. The door swung shut behind him with a deep, echoing boom, a sound of finality that sealed him inside with the ghosts of the past. The room was a tomb of forgotten glory, a silent, dusty testament to a martial history that had been deliberately abandoned. Racks of swords lined the walls, their once proud blades now consumed by a deep, orange rust, their hilts dark and pitted. Tattered banners, their vibrant colors faded to muted, ghostly shades, hung like sleeping bats from the high, vaulted ceiling, their embroidered crests barely legible in the strange, cold light. And then there were the suits of armor, dozens of them. They stood in silent, ordered rows, metal sentinels guarding a history that no one cared about anymore. They were relics of a bygone age of justs and battles and crusades. But they were not the gleaming, polished figures of Sir Philip's memory. They were shrouded in cobwebs, their joints seized with rust, their surfaces coated in a thick, gray mantle of dust. They were empty shells, hollow monuments to forgotten men, their powerful forms now just a sad, slow feast for time and decay. The air was thick with the smell of cold stone, damp, and the faint metallic tang of oxidizing steel. It was the smell of a place that had died. Sir Philip walked slowly down the central aisle, between the two rows of silent, metal knights. His heart ached with a profound sense of sorrow. This room, which had once been a symbol of the Lovell family's strength and honor, a place of vibrant, living history, had been allowed to rot. It was a physical manifestation of the sickness he felt in the castle, a clear sign that the new lord had no respect for the noble lineage he had inherited. This neglect was more than just carelessness. It was an insult. It was an attempt to erase the past, to bury the legacy of the true lords of Lovell. As he walked, he scanned the room, his eyes trying to make sense of the strange, pale light, and he quickly realized its source. In the very center of the chamber, standing alone in a wide, open space, was one suit of armor that was completely different from all the rest. And it was this armor, this single, solitary figure, that was the source of the unnatural silvery light. It stood on a low, stone dais, set apart from its rusting brethren, as if it were a king surrounded by a court of dead peasants. Unlike the others, this suit was not covered in dust or rust. Its steel was polished to a mirror-like sheen, so bright and so clean that it seemed to hum with a life of its own. It was this polished surface that was catching some unseen, unknown light source and radiating it throughout the room, creating the cold, ethereal glow. The armor was a masterpiece of the armorer's art, its plates perfectly articulated, its form both powerful and graceful. It was a suit designed for a great lord, a warrior of immense stature and skill. Sir Philip approached it slowly. His sense of sorrow now mingled with a growing sense of awe and a deep, humming dread. Why was this one suit so different? Why was it so immaculately preserved when all the others had been left to decay? Who had been tending to it, polishing its steel in this long-abandoned room? The gentle, metallic sighing he had heard from the corridor, the clink-clank. He knew now that it had come from this figure. It was the sound of its perfectly balanced plates settling under some unseen internal stress. He was standing directly before it now, close enough to see his own distorted reflection in the polished curve of its breastplate. He saw a man, old and weary, his face etched with concern. The armor was empty. He could see through the narrow eye-slit of the great helm into the darkness within. And yet, it did not feel empty. It had a presence. It stood with a kind of proud, defiant posture, its gauntlet hands resting on the hilt of a great sword whose point was planted on the dais before it. It did not look like an object. It looked like a man, waiting patiently for a battle that was long overdue. It was then that he saw the detail that turned his creeping dread into a cold, hard spike of horror. On the left side of the polished breastplate, directly over the place where a human heart would beat, the mirror-like sheen of the steel was marred. There was a dark, ugly, and terribly familiar-looking stain. It was not a patch of rust. It was not a tarnish. It was a stain in the metal, a discoloration that seemed to be a part of the steel itself. It was a deep, dark, reddish-brown, the color of old, dried blood, and its shape was unmistakable. It was the shape of a violent, splattering impact, with smaller, darker rivulets running down from it, like tears of blood that had been shed by the armor itself. It was a bloodstain that no amount of polishing, no passage of time, had been able to erase. It was a permanent scar, a wound that the armor itself refused to let heal. A wave of nausea and cold recognition washed over Sir Philip. He felt as if the stone floor were tilting beneath his feet. He knew this armor. He had seen it before many years ago. He had helped his friend arm himself in it. He knew the intricate scrollwork on the pauldrons, the unique, wolf-head design of the gauntlets. There was no doubt. This was the personal battle-worn armor of his dearest friend, the old Lord Lovell. The last he had seen this armor, it had been gleaming and perfect. And the last he had heard of his friend, he had been told that Lord Lovell had died of a fever during a campaign in France. He had been buried there on foreign soil with full military honors. That was the official story. The story that had been sent back, the story that the new Baron, his distant cousin, had inherited the castle upon. But this armor told a very different story. This armor, with its ugly, indelible bloodstain directly over the heart, did not speak of a peaceful death from illness in a campaign tent. It screamed of a violent, treacherous, and fatal blow. It screamed of a sword thrust, a dagger in the back, a betrayal of the most intimate and terrible kind. The armor had not been in France. It was here, which meant that Lord Lovell had not died in France. He had died here, in his own castle, in his own armory. He had been murdered. The realization was a physical blow. Sir Philip staggered back, his hand flying to his own heart, his mind reeling from the sheer, monstrous weight of the implication. The lies, the decades of lies. The new Baron, the cold-eyed man who now ruled this castle, had not inherited it through a sad accident of fate. He had inherited it through a bloody act of treason. This artifact, this beautifully preserved suit of armor, was not a memorial. It was a piece of evidence, a silent witness to a murder, and its strange, supernatural properties, the cold light, the metallic size, suddenly made a new and terrifying kind of sense. This was a cursed artifact, an object so deeply connected to the trauma of its owner's death that it had become a vessel for his unresolved spirit, for his unending cry for justice. He looked at the armor with new eyes. It was no longer just a suit of steel. It was a relic of a tragedy. It was the tomb of his friend's honor. The bloodstain was not just a mark. It was a mouth, screaming a silent story of betrayal that had been suppressed for 20 years. And he, Sir Philip Harclay, was the first person in all that time who had been willing to come into this cold, dead room and finally listen. The sorrow he had felt earlier was now consumed by a burning, righteous fury. The quest he had unknowingly embarked upon now had a clear and terrible purpose. He had to uncover the truth. He had to avenge his friend. The armor had shown him the secret. Now he had to act upon it. And he had a terrible feeling that the armor had more to tell him still. The armory had ceased to be a room of memories. It had become a courtroom. Sir Philip Harclay stood as the sole juror, and the silent, gleaming suit of armor stood as the star witness, the accuser, and the ghost of the victim all in one. The revelation that his friend, Lord Lovell, had been murdered here, in this very room, had settled into his soul like a shard of ice. The cold, dispassionate cruelty of it, the depth of the betrayal, was a wound far deeper than any he had ever received on a physical battlefield. The grief he had carried for 20 years was now ignited into a cold, hard flame of righteous fury. The sickness he had felt in the castle now had a name. It was the cancer of a secret, unpunished crime. He stared at the armor, his mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of a 20-year-old puzzle. The bloodstain over the heart was the undeniable truth at the center of it all. Who had done it? And why? The new Baron, the cold-eyed cousin, was the obvious beneficiary. He had gained the title, the lands, the entire Lovell fortune. The motive was as old as humanity itself. Greed and ambition. But how had he accomplished it? How had he managed to conceal such a monstrous act, to invent a story of a hero's death in a foreign land and have it be believed by the entire world? As Sir Philip stood there, lost in his dark and furious thoughts, the world outside the armory seemed to sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. The distant storm, which had been a low, rumbling backdrop, now began to gather its strength, as if drawn to the burgeoning confrontation within the castle walls. The wind began to howl with a new and savage intensity, and the low rumble of thunder grew closer, more menacing. The storm was no longer just a storm. It was an overture, a dramatic, natural accompaniment to the supernatural drama that was about to unfold. Just as Sir Philip, his mind now made up, took a step forward, intending to examine the bloodstain more closely, to perhaps even touch the cold steel that had been his friend's final shield, it happened. A flash of lightning, so brilliant and so close it seemed to be right outside the armory walls, lit up the dusty air with a momentary, blinding white glare. It was followed, almost instantly, by a deafening clap of thunder. It was not a rumble this time. It was a cataclysmic explosion of sound, a celestial hammer blow that seemed to shake the very foundations of Lovell Castle. The stone floor beneath his feet vibrated, and the ancient, rusted weapons on the walls rattled in their racks. And in the profound, ringing silence that followed that cataclysmic roar, the true horror began. The suit of armor moved, It was not the gentle, almost imperceptible shifting he had heard before. This was a definite, undeniable, and utterly terrifying movement. The metal plates of the armor began to rattle and grind against each other with a harsh, discordant clangor. The gauntlet hands, which had been resting passively on the hilt of the greatsword, tightened their grip, the sound of metal scraping on metal setting his teeth on edge. The entire suit seemed to shudder, to tense up, as if a powerful, invisible current of energy had just shot through it. It was as if the thunderclap had been a jolt of lightning to a dead man's heart, shocking it back into a grotesque, mechanical semblance of life. Sir Philip froze, his hand outstretched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched, mesmerized by a terror so profound it transcended all his previous experiences of fear. The armor was trying to move. It was trying to take a breath. The great, barrel-shaped chest plate seemed to expand slightly, and a low, groaning sound, like the sound of tortured, rusting metal, emanated from within. It was the sound of an empty thing trying to draw air into lungs it did not possess. The helmet, which had been facing directly forward, turned. It moved with a slow, grinding, and agonizingly stiff motion, the neckpiece scraping and groaning, and it turned its dark, empty eye slit until it was looking directly at him. He was being watched. Not by a man, not by an object, but by something in between. A haunted relic. A cursed artifact that was now animated by the sheer, unquenchable force of the will of the man who had died within it. The strange, pale light that emanated from the steel seemed to brighten, to pulse with a new and more intense energy. The chilling encounter had escalated. The witness was no longer silent. It was about to give its testimony. And then, a voice emerged from it. It was not a human voice. It was a dry, rasping, and profoundly strange sound, seeming to come from the hollow emptiness of the great helm. It was a whisper, but a whisper that carried the metallic, resonant quality of the armor itself. It was the sound of rustling steel, of wind whistling through a cracked and empty visor. It was the voice of a spectral figure, a ghost speaking through a machine of iron and sorrow. And the voice whispered a single, chilling word, a word that was half sigh, half hiss, a word that seemed to be formed from the very coldness of the room itself. The word hung in the air, a drop of pure, venomous poison. It was not just a word, it was an accusation, a confirmation of everything Sir Philip had just deduced. It was the dying word of his friend, echoing across a chasm of 20 years, delivered by the most impossible of messengers. The sound was full of an ancient, bottomless sorrow, but beneath the sorrow, there was a cold, hard, and unforgiving rage. The rage of a man who had been struck down not by an honorable foe on a field of battle, but by the treacherous hand of someone he had trusted. The spectral whisper faded, but the weight of the word remained, pressing down on the silence of the room. The armor stood still once more, its helmet still fixed upon him, a silent, accusatory sentinel. Sir Philip's mind was a maelstrom of horror and fury. The ghost of his friend was here, trapped, bound to the very instrument of his own death, unable to rest until his murder was avenged. A wave of profound and sorrowful duty washed over Sir Philip, extinguishing the last of his personal fear. He was no longer just a friend seeking the truth. He was now an agent of justice, a knight enlisted in the service of a ghost. Driven by this new and terrible purpose, a mix of horror, duty, and a deep, abiding love for his fallen friend, he stepped forward. He did not know what he intended to do. He only knew that he had to make a connection. He had to acknowledge the spirit, to show it that he had heard, that he understood. He reached out his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, towards the dark, ugly stain on the polished breastplate. He had to touch it. He had to feel the scar that his friend now wore for eternity. His fingertips made contact with the cold steel of the bloodstain. The moment he touched it, a shock of pure, supernatural cold, far more intense than anything he had felt before, shot up his arm. It was a cold that felt like a physical blow, a bolt of Arctic ice that seemed to stop his own heart for a second. The metal did not feel like metal. It felt like a block of ancient, frozen grave dirt. And in that same instant, the whisper came again. But this time, it was not the faint, rasping sound from the helmet. This time, it was directly inside his own mind. The voice was clearer now, more defined, a direct, telepathic communication from the tormented spirit bound to the armor. It was the voice of his friend, Lord Lovell, but it was a voice warped and distorted by 20 years of death and rage. And the voice in his head whispered a new, and even more terrifying, message. He is still here. The words were not just a statement. They were a warning, a chilling, desperate warning. The traitor, the murderer, he was not just a figure from the past. He was the present-day danger. He was here, in Lovell Castle, The murderer, or perhaps his heir, his bloodline, the one who had benefited from the betrayal, was still in power. The shadowy conspiracy had never ended. The ghost was not just speaking of a past crime. It was warning him of a current and mortal threat. Sir Philip snatched his hand back from the armor as if he had been burned. He stumbled back, his mind reeling from the psychic intrusion, the voice of his dead friend still echoing in the silent chambers of his soul. The armor stood impassive, its head still turned towards him, its light pulsing gently, its message delivered. It had given him the two crucial pieces of the puzzle. The crime was betrayal, and the criminal was still within these walls. The rest was up to him. The ghostly figure had given him his quest. The cursed artifact had revealed its purpose. It was not just a passive, haunted object. It was an active participant in its own story, a vengeful spirit crying out for a justice it could not achieve on its own. It had waited 20 years for someone of honor, someone with the courage to listen, to enter this room. And now it had found him. The unsolved betrayal was now Sir Philip's to solve. And he knew, with a cold, grim certainty, that this path would lead him into a direct and deadly conflict with the new, cold-eyed lord of Lovell Castle. The ghost of the past had just declared war on the present, and he, Sir Philip Harclay, was now its chosen champion. The echo of the ghostly whisper faded from Sir Philip's mind, but the chilling imprint of its message was permanently etched upon his soul. He stood in the center of the cold, silent armory, a man who had just conversed with the dead. His entire understanding of the world shattered and reformed into a new and terrible shape. The armor stood before him, its pale, silvery light now seeming less like a supernatural beacon and more like a soul fire, the last, lingering essence of his murdered friend, Lord Lovell. It was no longer just a suit of steel. It was a testament, a headstone, and a cry for vengeance. The first part of the mystery had been solved, but in a way that only deepened the horror. The official story was a lie. The comfortable, digestible narrative of a hero's death in a foreign land was a carefully constructed fiction designed to conceal a monstrous truth. Lord Lovell had not died of a fever in France. He had been murdered, struck down by a traitor's blow, right here in the heart of his own ancestral home. The bloodstain on the breastplate was not a battle scar. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a story of betrayal. This revelation transformed the armor from a simple cursed artifact into something far more profound. It was now a witness, a silent, metal witness that had absorbed the final, agonizing moments of its master's life. The supernatural phenomena, the cold light, the metallic sighs, the rattling movement, the ghostly whisper were not the random acts of a simple haunting. They were a desperate, focused attempt at communication. They were the actions of a spirit so wronged, so consumed by the injustice of his end, that he had imbued the very steel he wore with his own undying will to see the truth revealed. The armor had become a clue from the grave, a mysterious and terrifying piece of evidence left behind by a soul that could not rest. It was the ultimate cold case, and the victim himself was providing the first crucial lead. This new knowledge immediately cast the entire castle, and its new master, in a sinister, predatory light. The coldness Sir Philip had felt from the new baron, the furtive, fearful behavior of the servants, the deliberate neglect of the Lovell family historiate was not just the behavior of a man unsuited to his title. It was the behavior of a guilty man, a man sitting on a throne that was not rightfully his, a man constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified that the ghosts of his own crimes would rise up to condemn him. The ghostly whisper, "Traitor," had confirmed the crime, but the second whisper, the one that had been delivered directly into his mind upon his touch, was the one that truly chilled him to the bone. He is still here. This was the key. The betrayal was not a closed chapter in a history book. The danger was not in the past. It was present. It was alive and breathing within the very walls of Lovell Castle. He is still here. The he could only refer to one person, the murderer. Or, if 20 years had passed, perhaps the murderer's son, his heir, the one who continued to benefit from the original bloody crime. The shadowy conspiracy that had led to Lord Lovell's death was not over. It had simply entered a new phase, the phase of suppression, of maintaining the lie. The new baron was not just the beneficiary of a crime. He was the guardian of its secret. And Sir Philip, by entering this room and communicating with the dead, had just declared himself the enemy of that secret. He was no longer just a guest in the castle. He was a threat. This realization brought with it a wave of cold, clear-headed danger. He was alone, an old knight in a castle now ruled by his friend's murderer. He was surrounded by enemies, both visible and unseen. The very walls that he had once thought of as a second home were now hostile territory. Every shadow could conceal a spy, every closed door could hide a new threat. The quest for justice for his friend would also be a battle for his own survival. And this led him to the final, and most profound, level of the mystery, the question that lingered in the cold, still air of the armory long after the whispers had faded. What was the true nature of the armor's haunting? What was the source of its supernatural power? The question was not just academic. It was crucial. To understand the weapon the ghost had given him, he had to understand the ghost itself. The first possibility was the most straightforward, in the context of a ghost story. The armor itself was haunted. The sheer trauma and violent emotion of Lord Lovell's final moments had been so powerful that they had permanently imprinted themselves upon the object he was wearing. The steel had become a kind of psychic sponge, absorbing the rage, the sorrow, and the desperate need for justice. The armor was now an automaton, a vessel that would endlessly replay the echoes of that terrible moment. The light, the sounds, the whispers, they were all a kind of residual haunting, a memory loop playing out for eternity, waiting for a receptive audience to witness it. In this scenario, the ghost was the armor itself, a cursed artifact given a semblance of life by the tragic energy it contained. But there was a second, more personal and perhaps more powerful possibility. What if the armor was not the ghost, but was merely a conduit? A tool being used by a separate and still sentient spiritual entity? What if the true ghost of Lord Lovell, his conscious soul, his Akh as the Egyptians would have called it, was still tethered to this place, unable to move on? And what if he was using the one object most intimately connected to his death, his own armor, as a means of communication, a kind of spiritual telephone to the world of the living? This theory felt more correct to Sir Philip. The whispers had not felt like a mindless echo. They had felt intelligent, directed. The final warning, "He is still here," was not a memory. It was a piece of fresh intelligence, a direct and purposeful communication. He had not been interacting with a haunted object. He had been interacting with the tormented but still aware soul of his friend. Lord Lovell was here, a spectral figure trapped between worlds, his existence a constant, silent vigil over the scene of his own murder. The armor was his anchor, his voice box, his one and only way to reach out and touch the world he had been so violently torn from. This thought filled Sir Philip with a profound and terrible sadness, but also with a grim resolve. His friend was not at peace. He was a prisoner, not just of the castle, but of his own unresolved murder. The quest for justice was now more than just a matter of honor. It was a sacred duty to free his friend's soul from its earthly torment. Sir Philip stood up, his old bones creaking, but his spirit filled with a new, cold fire. He looked at the suit of armor, no longer with fear, but with a sense of solemn, brotherly communion. "I hear you, my friend," he whispered into the silent, cold air. "I hear you, and I give you my knightly vow. Your death will be answered for. The traitor will be known." As he spoke these words, a strange thing happened. The pale, silvery light that had been emanating from the armor seemed to soften, to pulse once with a gentle, almost grateful warmth. And the faint, metallic sighing, the clink-clank, which had started up again, fell silent. It was as if the spirit, having finally found its champion, could now rest for a time, its long 20-year vigil passed on to another. Sir Philip turned and walked towards the great oak door. He knew what he had to do. He had to return to the world of the living, to the court of the cold-eyed baron, and he had to play a dangerous game of observation and intrigue. He had to search for proof, for a chink in the armor of the 20-year-old lie. He now held the most terrible secret in Lovell Castle, and that knowledge made him both the most powerful man within its walls and the most vulnerable. The unsolved betrayal was his to solve. The path forward was fraught with peril. He was one man against a shadowy conspiracy, armed with nothing but his honor, his sword, and the ghostly whispers of a murdered friend. The question of who, exactly, had plunged the dagger into Lord Lovell's heart was a question he would have to answer. And he knew, with a grim certainty, that the answer would likely lead to more violence, more bloodshed, within the cold stone walls of this ancient, haunted estate. The ghost had called for justice, and Sir Philip knew that the price of justice, in a place like this, was often paid in blood. The story of the blood-stained armor was far from over. A new, and perhaps even more tragic, chapter was just beginning. Philip pulls his hand back, the icy cold of the metal and the ghostly whisper seared into his soul. The armor stands silent once more, but its message is clear. A dark betrayal lies at the heart of Lovell Castle. Is the armor truly haunted by a spectral figure, or is it something else? And the most pressing question of all, who betrayed the old Lord Lovell? Let me know your theory. Thanks for braving the shadows with Grey Vale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.